Adonai Tzuri, Adonai Tzuri, Adonai Tzuri, Begoli. Meiul Ratzon, Nidre Adonai Tzuri, Adonai Tzuri, Begoli, Adonai Tzuri, Begoli, Amen.
Good Yontif. Tzom kal, an easy and a meaningful fast. Hannah Arendt wrote that regarding the Holocaust, human history has known no story more difficult to tell. Before Elie Wiesel wrote down his experience and published it, most survivors were too traumatized or embarrassed to recount their experiences, much less address its moral lessons and imperatives. Elie's friend, colleague Michael Berenbaum distilled him thus: more than any human being I know, Elie Wiesel was responsible for changing the status of Holocaust survivors from victims and refugees to witnesses with a moral mission, not only to remember the past, but to transform the future. He used the moral authority of his own experience to plead for others, to arouse compassion, to rally against indifference. In embodying the memory of those silenced and annihilated, Wiesel claimed the mantle of moral compass. If I survived, he wrote, it must be for some reason. I must do something with my life. It is too serious to play games with anymore, because in my place, someone else could have been saved, and so I speak for that person. And now Elie no longer speaks, and soon, too soon, the living testimony of the last remaining survivors will be no more. And when that moment arrives, the Shoah will no longer be memory, but only history. History that compellingly calls upon us to learn its lessons, lest we be condemned to repeat them. Eliezer Wiesel was born in the small Romanian hamlet of Sighet on September 30th, Simchas Torah, 1928. To his parents, Sarah Feig and Shlomo Wiesel, Elie was their third of 4 children, the only boy. He began his Jewish education at the tender age of 3. His father, Shlomo, would later encourage him to study modern Hebrew literature, while his mother, Sarah, urged him to focus on the sacred texts of Judaism. As Elie would later recount, his father was the source of his humanism, but his mother was the seat of his faith. Elie's grandfather and mentor, Doide Feig, was a disciple of the Vishnitz Hasidic sect, the town of Vishnitz just north and east over the border in the Ukraine. In April of 1940, Hungary annexed Sighet and forced its Jewish citizens into 2 local ghettos. Nevertheless, Jewish life in Sighet somehow adjusted and continued, and Eli celebrated becoming bar mitzvah in 1942. But beginning on May 17th through May 21st of 1944, when Eli was 15 years old, the Jews of Sighet and the surrounding communities, some 14,000 individuals, were taken from those ghettos by the Nazis and sent by cattle car to Auschwitz-Birkenau. His mother and sister were separated from Eli and his dad immediately upon arrival. It was the last time he would ever see his mother or his little sister Tzipora again. Alongside his father, Eli was sent to Buna Monowitz, also known as Auschwitz III, a slave labor camp for I.G. Farben's Buna work. It's the industrial complex to make rubber. Eli was tattooed with the inmate number, many of you know, A7713, on his left arm. For 8 months, he and his father were enslaved there as forced laborers. But as the war was nearing its end, they were forced on a death march to Buchenwald. It was there that Eli's dad died at the end of January 1945 after a beating by a German soldier. Buchenwald was to be liberated just a few months later by the United States Third Army on April 14, 1945. These events were the basis, I think you know, for Wiesel's 1955 memoir, Night. After a brief hospitalization, Eli joined a group of 400 Jewish orphans who were transported to Normandy, France. Once there, he tried to immigrate to Palestine, but was denied. He soon discovered, though, that his older sisters, Beatrice and Hilda, had survived, and he was reunited with them briefly. Now 16 years old, Eli dedicated himself to mastering French and completed his high school studies. In 1948, he matriculated at the Sorbonne in Paris, taking courses in literature, philosophy, psychology, but never finishing his degree. He worked instead as a professional journalist for both Israeli and French periodicals. His career opportunity came as the Paris-based international correspondent for the Israeli daily Yediot Ahronot. It was there in Paris in 1954 that he interviewed the French Nobel laureate for literature, François Mauriac. It would become the flashpoint that transformed Elie Wiesel into a witness and speaker for the annihilated. Recounted by Wiesel, every topic the devout Catholic Mauriac spoke about, he would relate back to Jesus and his suffering. Finally, Elie burst out that while Christians feel compelled to constantly speak about Jesus' suffering, quote, 10 years ago, not very far from here, I knew Jewish children, every one of whom suffered 1,000 times more, 6 million times more than Christ on the cross. And we don't speak about them. Wiesel ran from the room, embarrassed. But Mauriac followed him and asked Wiesel about his experiences, advising him, urging him to write them down. What began as an angry 862-page Yiddish indictment of God and humanity's failure to intervene, und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and world was silent, Wiesel soon revised and distilled into the petite yet powerful French volume La Nuit, that in 1958 cracked open for the world the untold narrative of the Shoah. It would be translated into English and published in 1960 as Night, now slimmed further to a mere 116 pages, short enough for a junior high school student to read through more than once. In 1961, Night would be followed by his next book in the trilogy, Dawn, a powerful meditation on the transformation of victims into defenders and potential victimizers. That same year, Elie covered the Eichmann trial for the Jewish Daily Forward. Wiesel had relocated here to New York City in 1956 in order to cover the United Nations. And it was here, yes, that he had the ultimate New York experience. He was struck by a taxi cab and confined to a wheelchair for almost a year. Fortuitous. Unable to renew the French travel documents that identified him as a stateless person, Elie applied for American naturalization. By 1963, Elie Wiesel was a citizen of the U.S. of A. Following a visit to the Soviet Union in 1965, Elie wrote The Jews of Silence, which recounted the plight of Jews at that time under Soviet repression. He became a most eloquent spokesman for the struggle of Soviet Jews to emigrate. Their hope, he wrote, is greater than we dare hope for, greater than we can explain. But the crucial question is whether we Jews who live in freedom are worthy of their courage and their faith. As his friend Michael Berenbaum explained, Elie linked his struggle as a Holocaust survivor who had felt abandoned by Western Jewry to the struggle of Soviet Jewry, and offered to complacent and comfortable diaspora Jews the opportunity of redemption, the chance now to participate in the drama of the liberation of a people enslaved, to succeed with the Soviet Jewish community as they had once failed to rescue Jews under Nazi domination. In 1968, he wrote the book A Beggar in Jerusalem, a meditation on Jewish suffering and loss refracted through the reunification of Jerusalem following the Six-Day War. Elie was an ardent lover and defender of the Jewish state, even being offered its ceremonial post of president on at least 2 occasions. But he was a New Yorker, transplanted, but roots deep. It was here that Elie met his wife, Marion Rose, also a survivor of the Shoah. They married in Jerusalem, where else, in 1969. Marion would go on to become Elie's official English language translator for his many books yet to come. And in 1972, Elie became a father, giving his son the Hebrew name Shlomo Elisha in memorial to his own father. That same year, he was invited to serve as Distinguished Professor of Judaic Studies at the City University of New York. And then in 1978, he was offered the Andrew Mellon Professorship of Humanities at Boston University, where he taught until 2013. But he commuted each week from his home in Manhattan to Boston. In 1978, President Carter appointed him as chairman of the nascent United States Holocaust Memorial Council. But Elie's most prophetic and prominent moment came on April 19, 1985. You'll recall he was awarded the U.S. Congressional Gold Medal of Achievement. It was a fortuitous moment in history, marking then the 42nd anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and just 2 weeks prior to President Reagan's planned trip to Bitburg, Germany, to lay a wreath at the German military cemetery there alongside Chancellor Helmut Kohl. At the award ceremony on April 19th, Wiesel challenged Reagan, quote, "I belong to a people that speaks truth to power. Mr. President, your place is not that place. Your place is with the victims of the SS." Asked afterwards by reporters if he was concerned that he might appear to be lecturing the President of the United States, Elie responded, No, I'm not a moralist. I am a teacher. I am a storyteller. I have words, nothing else. I represent nobody. All I did was give him a few words." Wiesel's few words did not sway the president, but it did speak volumes about American democracy as well as our place in it. And it shifted German self-consciousness about their parents' generation's participation and complicity in the Shoah. There were no more Bitburgs in American foreign policy. In 1986, Elie received the Nobel Prize for Peace. More on that in just a moment. In December of 1987, Ellie addressed hundreds of thousands at the March for Soviet Jewry on the National Mall on the eve of the Washington summit between Reagan and Gorbachev. Who was there? Was anyone? A few? Wiesel told those gathered that had such a march by American Jews occurred during the years of the Shoah, quote, millions of Jews would have been saved. Too many were silent then. We are not silent today. And he was right. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush presented Ellie with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest award that can be granted to a United States civilian. And in 1993, Ellie spoke at the dedication of the long delayed U.S. Holocaust Memorial Now Museum in Washington, D.C. His words are carved into the entryway to the museum. If you've stopped to look, for the dead and the living, we must bear witness. Elie Wiesel was outspoken about the suffering of all peoples, first and foremost his own. Yet his commitments to his own faith and his own people did not diminish his commitment to humanity. In Norway, receiving his Nobel, he said, "Of course, since I'm a Jew, profoundly rooted in my people's memory and tradition, my first response is to Jewish fears, Jewish needs, Jewish crises. It would be unnatural for me not to make Jewish priorities my own. Israel, Soviet Jewry, Jews in Arab lands. But others are important to me as well. Apartheid," he said, "is in my view as abhorrent as anti-Semitism. To me, Andrei Sakharov's isolation is as much a disgrace as Joseph Begun's imprisonment and Ida Nudel's exile, as is the denial of solidarity in Poland and its leader Lech Wałęsa's right to dissent and Nelson Mandela's interminable imprisonment. Elie Wiesel did not see his Jewish identity and commitments precluding his human identity and commitments. They were, in fact, he had learned, inextricably bound up in one another. The Jewish people, because of the uniqueness of its suffering in the Shoah, had a role still to be a light unto the nations. Reflecting back on his own experiences, Wiesel said in an interview, "If it hadn't been for the war, I would not have written, probably. I would have become a teacher of the Talmud. I would be obsessed and concerned with my little Jewish world, my religious needs. After the war, I became more tolerant of people. Before, I didn't know any non-Jews. If I had to walk by a church, I would change sidewalks so as not to walk in front of it. My fear of the other was a wall. Without the war, I would never have questioned any of my beliefs. I wouldn't have been involved in action. The event," which is what he called the Holocaust, "the event made me realize the urgency of personal commitment." As a survivor, Elie identified viscerally with the suffering and the oppressed. Having lived through the world's indifference and silence, he dedicated himself to the plight of the oppressed. Elie's role led him to travel and investigate hotspots around the globe. I don't know how he did it holding a professorship, but here's just a little list. In the 1970s, he railed against indifference and starvation in Biafra. He advocated on behalf of the indigenous Ake tribe in Paraguay. He protested against South African apartheid. He called attention to Argentina's policy of disappearing people during its dirty war. He traveled to Thailand during a genocide and delivered food to starving Cambodians. In 1984, he went to the Honduran jungle to meet with the Miskito Indians who were being persecuted by the Sandinistas. In the early 1990s, he lobbied the U.S. government on behalf of victims of ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. He spoke out on behalf of the people of Tibet suffering under Chinese occupation. In September 2006, he and George Clooney appeared in front of the United Nations Security Council to bring attention to the crisis in Darfur. In 2007, his foundation issued a letter criticizing the Turkish government's ongoing denial of the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. It was signed by Wiesel and 52 other Nobel laureates. And in July of 2009, Wiesel announced his support to the minority Tamils in Sri Lanka, saying, quote, "Wherever minorities are being persecuted, we must raise our voices to protest." And over a lifetime, that is what Elie Wiesel did. Raised his voice at injustice, shined a spotlight on suffering and persecution. He won't let you turn your eyes away. He won't let you ignore. Elie Wiesel has emerged as one of the most important spiritual leaders and guides in an age when violence, repression, and racism continue to characterize the world. That was the Nobel Prize Committee in 1986. Wiesel is a messenger to all mankind. His message is one of peace, atonement, and human dignity. His belief that the forces fighting evil in the world can be victorious is a hard-won belief. His message is based on his own personal experience of total humiliation and of the utter contempt for humanity shown in Hitler's death camps. Wiesel's commitment, which originated in the sufferings of the Jewish people, has been widened to embrace all repressed peoples and races. In accepting the prize and responding to the committee's words, Elie commented, "We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere when human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy. National borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must at the moment become our center of the universe. Human suffering anywhere concerns men and women everywhere." "I have tried," he wrote, "to keep memory alive. I've tried to fight those who would forget. Because if we forget, we are guilty. We are accomplices. We were naive," he wrote. "The world did know, and it was silent. And that is why I swore never to be silent whenever, wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. I have faith still," Elie wrote. "Faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and even in God's creation. Without it, no action would be possible, and action is the only remedy to indifference, the most insidious danger of all. There is so much to be done. There is so much that can be done. One person, a Raoul Wallenberg, an Albert Schweitzer, a Martin Luther King Jr., one person of integrity can make a difference of life and death. Our lives no longer belong to us alone," he declared. "They belong to all those who need us now so desperately." Thank you, members of the Nobel Committee, for declaring on this singular occasion that our survival, the survival of the Jewish people, has meaning for all mankind. Tonight, in Elie's absence, the question that looms before us is, what is that meaning? In late November 2013, Israeli President Shimon Peres, Zichrono Livracha, conferred Israel's highest civilian honor, the President's Medal of Distinction, on Elie Wiesel for, quote, "his unique contribution to the memorial of the Holocaust, the remembrance of the Holocaust, and in light of his uncompromising drive for peace and tolerance. Peres commented, "The Holocaust taught us that killing isn't just done with guns and weapons, but also with apathy." And you, Ellie, are saving the world from that apathy. Indifference and apathy come to accuse us all. Indifference and apathy can make us all complicit. Morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings. Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. The words of Wiesel's older contemporary, Abraham Joshua Heschel, himself a refugee from Nazi Germany. Tonight I would close with these words to consider, the closing comment of Heschel, which I think summarizes the teaching of Elie Wiesel. In a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. May we all seek to be responsible not only for our own lives, but for the world we live in.